This lesson is Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, and if you did today's Do Now activity, you've already heard Patrick Stewart recite the sonnet, but now we're going to access the text of the sonnet, and I'm going to walk you through trying to make sense of its meaning. So Shakespeare's sonnets are referred to both as the number, in this case, number 18, and the other way that they're referenced is by the first line. So this sonnet is frequently known as "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" So let's read it once, and I would like to also show you that on this link that I've included, it is already discussed and analyzed. And if you look down here, you see some very specific line-by-line analysis. And so you can feel free to just read this site and you'll have a full understanding of the sonnet. But Shakespeare says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." So what we'll do now is we'll talk about this sonnet in its form and also its meaning. The first thing that I would ask you to do is count the lines, and if you do that, you'll notice that there are 14 lines in the sonnet. After you notice that, I'd like to remind you that we know that sonnets are broken into 3 quatrains, 3 groups of 4 lines. So this would be quatrain 1, this would be quatrain 2, and this would be quatrain 3. Each group of 4 lines is called a quatrain. And then the last 2 lines are a couplet. The next thing I'd ask you to notice is the rhyme scheme. Shakespeare rhymes day with May, that would be our A rhyme. Temperate and date, that's our B rhyme. Shines and declines would be our C. Dimmed and untrimmed would be D. We'll go to the E rhyme now with fade and shade, and the F rhyme is owest and growest. C and D both rhyme, and that forms our couplet rhyme, which is G, G. And just remember, those letters are nothing more than markers, ways of identifying which end rhyme is happening in each line. It's actually not all that complicated. So the next thing that we should understand when we're talking about sonnets are speaker and poet are not the same thing. So in this sonnet, Shakespeare isn't speaking to us. Instead, he has a speaker, and that speaker is the voice of the poem. And the speaker tells us right in the first line, "I want to make a comparison, and I'm thinking about comparing you to a summer's day. What do you think? Is that a good idea?" He raises the question. Well, if you remember the lecture on the common themes and metaphors, we know that summer is sort of that peak of life, that best experience, that highlight of the year, right? The highlight moments of our life. So he's saying, should I compare you to that best time of the year? And then in the next line, he takes a turn and he says, well, I would, but thou means you're more lovely and more temperate. You have a better temperament than summertime does. He says, summertime, there's rough winds and they shake the buds on the flowers and the trees that have come out in May. And, summer only lasts 3 months. It's not very long. It has all too short a date. Its lease, its amount of time has too short a date. He goes on to say, sometimes even the sunshine is too hot. So let's remember, he says, should I compare you to a summer's day? And then he comes up with these sort of 4 negative things that summer is. He's like, summer's not really good enough to compare to you. And then he goes on in the second quatrain, this group of 4 lines, and he says, often his gold complexion is dimmed, I'm sorry, I marked the wrong 4 lines, these 4 lines. He says, sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and that eye of heaven is the sun, and it shines too hot. And sometimes he says its gold complexion is dimmed, and that means that there has been shade cast on the day, and sometimes you can't see the sunshine. And he says, and every fair from fair sometimes declines. That means everything that is beautiful eventually fades or declines by chance or by nature, and just general changing, that we're all inclined to eventually not be as awesome as that peak point in life and time, summertime. And he says, but your eternal summer, he says, you will never fade. You will always be summer. So if you'll remember when we were talking about how sonnets come together, we discussed that in the first 3 quatrains, a problem, an issue, or an idea is presented. And what we see here is that the idea is that I'd like to compare you to something great like a summer's day, but they're not great enough. Summer's days have problems, and I don't see that in you. And so we see a sort of turn when we get to this 3rd quatrain, and he says, your eternal summer will never fade. You will be eternally beautiful. Well, that's a bit hyperbolic. Hyperbole is a gross exaggeration. And the idea that she could maintain this beauty and perfection of the peak of her life, her summertime, isn't actually possible, right? And he says, you'll never lose possession of that fairness that you own. And again, we know that aging happens with or without our consent. This is one of my favorite lines in Shakespearean poetry. He says, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. Death's never going to be able to brag that you came near the shade he throws. I like that line because a lot of times modern people will talk about throwing shade, and Shakespeare was throwing shade long before we decided we were going to use it in our colloquialisms. But he's saying death is never going to be able to throw shade at you. You're never going to be in the shady part that death can take you from. So all of this sounds very unrealistic. He's comparing someone he admires to a summer's day, but he's saying you're significantly better than a summer's day because you will be immortal. Well, that doesn't seem likely. So how does he resolve it in the couplet? He says, so long as men, I got ahead of myself again. He says, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. What he says here, this is the answer to the couplet. He says, I'm going to write lines about you that will be around forever, and the idea of you will continue to grow. And he finishes that in the couplet where he says, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So as long as there are men reading this poem, or people can even see it, then this poem will live, and so will your beauty. So the question, of course, we ask ourselves at the end is, did he immortalize her eternal summer? Did he make her beautiful for all time to never fade? And the answer, of course, is yes. Here, over 500 years later, we are reading Sonnet 18, and her immortal beauty still exists through the words of Shakespeare.